Hello, everyone. So nice to see everyone. If you're able to turn your cameras on, fantastic. If not, we completely understand. It's great to see these faces from everywhere. Welcome back to Past and Present with Allison Gilbert and her guests. We had a hiatus in the spring and summer, and we're happy to kick off this fall season with a series that focuses on self-care before and after loss. My name is Andrew Engel, and I am Senior Programmer at Reimagine. Our mission at Reimagine is to help people of all backgrounds face adversity, loss, and mortality, and channel the hard parts of life into meaningful action and growth. For Grief is the sponsor of Past and Present. Thank you so much, For Grief. For Grief offers a better way for people to navigate loss by offering unprecedented and direct access to the country's most preeminent grief experts and authors. Some of them are here, and you can learn more about For Grief at forgrief.com. I want to offer a few Zoom tips. I bet most of you are familiar with this, but I'm going to do it anyway. You can view the live transcription by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And here's something that I recently learned about. You can save the chat by clicking on the three dots within the chat box. And feel free to send me a note in the chat. If you have any technical issues, I might be able to help you. And I encourage you all to register for the second session of this series of Past and Present on October 26th, as Allison and her guests continue to develop this theme on self-care before and after loss. Next month, she'll be joined by Barry Grant and Jenny Lisk. And now, just a few words about Allison. Allison Gilbert is the author of numerous books, including her newest publication, Listen World, a biography of Hearst newspaper columnist Elsie Robinson. Her book, Past and Present, Keeping Memories of Loved Ones Alive, is the namesake of this series, and this book reveals creative ways to remember family and friends we never want to forget. You can follow Allison on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. She's everywhere at A. Gilbert Writer. And with that, once again, it's my pleasure to hand this over to Allison, who will introduce our guests.
Andy, thank you so much. I have been waiting for this day. The hiatus was hard on me. I wanted to get back to my family here at Reimagine with the help and the leadership of For Grief. We wouldn't be here without For Grief, so I am so grateful. And today's program means so much to me. This series means so much to me, and I would love to know where all of you are dialing in from. If you would do me a favor, go into the chat, tell me where you are from. I would love to see. I am joining you today from New York, and I am thrilled to be here. Today is somewhat special, and I will let you know why as I begin the conversation. My work with For Grief has been really meaningful to me, and part of that has been launching the For Grief Speakers Bureau. And today, every single expert you will hear from, they are a part of the For Grief Speakers Bureau. So it is my great pleasure to talk with these incredible experts today. As you know, the topic that we are going to be addressing is anxiety, navigating anxiety, depression, and guilt after loss. These are big issues. We're going to talk about them today. At about the half-hour mark, maybe 35 minutes into the conversation, I'm going to invite Christina Sirio if you can raise your hand. She is going to be helping us today. She'll be going through the chat. That is where I would like you to put your questions. We will not be bringing this large number of people onto the mic, so to speak. So put your questions in the chat. Christina will go through the chat, and then she will then read them to the appropriate author, expert, and we will get your questions answered. So I'm so excited to dig in, and I would like to start, if it's okay, with Reid. I have been a huge fan of your work. I listen to the Grief Refuge podcast. You have a voice that is just so soothing and warm. Your mission, if I can read it, is to help people find peace and purpose after loss. And I want to know what you mean by purpose and how that can help us navigate some of these really difficult and challenging emotions.
Well, hi everyone. I'm Reid. I'm happy to be here, and Allison, thanks for putting me in the hot seat, because that's not an easy question to answer. I guess the way I think about purpose is kind of knowing what life is. I'm a very complicated and pausing type of person. So our guest today, thank you for bearing with me, but psychology is my background. And so I often create a stutter, and I often think, unless I'm recording something, as Allison mentioned on the Grief Refuge podcast. But when I think of purpose, I think of like how you can make a contribution into life, and experiencing so much loss and supporting so many people who've experienced loss. I just often think about, there's a huge disconnect in finding purpose when we just are thrown into the depths of grief. And so when I kind of looked at how I could show up in the world, and when I made my conscious decision to do this professionally, I said, I really think I can help support people in providing and seeking and or also rediscovering purpose in their life again.
I guess to drill down a little bit more concretely, do you feel that if we don't have a purpose when we wake up in the morning, we don't have a goal, that it somehow thwarts our ability to move forward after a death of a loved one, a family member, a friend? How specifically does having a goal, a mission, a purpose provide some sort of balm to this experience?
Great question indeed. I don't know if there's an absolute yes or no to the question. I think it's very situational. I think there are appropriate times to actually not have purpose or be questioning your own purpose. There's so many transitions that happen in life that open us up into facing that reality. But I will say that in my experience, being middle-aged and also, listening to my elders throughout life and supporting people, no matter what age they are on their journeys, they've found life more gratifying. They found life more meaningful when they're living out a specific purpose in their life.
I think it's so interesting. And with Grief Refuge, you have certainly found yours. And because you've been so public about it, I want to talk a little bit very personally about where your purpose seems to have come from in terms of your work. Grief Refuge has a website. You run retreats that are beautiful. You have one coming up in the Bahamas. I'm waiting for my invitation to join you. That sounds fantastic. You run online courses, I guess you would call them, programs that are, I think, 12 weeks long. This really does seem to be your purpose. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what brought you here. And I would imagine, please tell me if I'm wrong, but you've been public about your father's death by suicide. And I wonder if you can talk about that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I lost my dad in 2006, April 2006, and quite honestly, it took me almost 10 years to fully acknowledge the reality of how he ended his life. I always describe it as an accident, and we'll probably get into, when we dive into guilt a little bit more, I can speak to a lot of personal experience associated with that loss. But what's really interesting is when he died, I was prepared for it and kind of relieved at the moment, because my whole adult life, I saw my biological father just experiencing a lot of personal suffering. A Vietnam veteran, post-traumatic stress disorder. I saw so much self-sabotage in his life as an adult, and as his son, it really hurt. And so when he died, that's what I'm speaking to as far as the relief. But over the years, I just kept processing my grief and recognized, oh, there's a lot of guilt associated with how I embraced my initial emotions of his loss.
I would love to come back to that specifically, but I do want to bring in Judy Lipson. Um, your experience of loss is quite different. Reid just talked about losing his father. When I book these events, when I decide who I would like to interview and I reach out and I request for you to be on, I try to make sure there is a real sweep of experience. And Judy, you lost both of your sisters, one quite suddenly in a car accident. You were the middle sister, and another one to anorexia and bulimia. So that seems like a very prolonged illness and struggle that she had. And you have said that it took you 30 years of wrestling with various emotions about their loss. And it wasn't until that 3-decade mark that you really started to think and parse and determine anxiety, depression, guilt, all these different feelings, and maybe different ones for you. But welcome. I know you've written a book, of course, about this experience, and we'll talk about your book too, but bring us into your family. Help us understand what happened.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you, my fellow speakers, and thank you all for being here. Losing my sisters, I think anybody who has siblings knows, and I was the middle sister, kind of squashed between the two of them. So I think I squashed it because I didn't think it was real. So I was in the denial phase, and I just kept squashing the grief. And I think as siblings, we don't take care of ourselves. We always have to take care of our parents or children or families or whatever. So our grief always takes the back seat. So all the emotions kept being pushed down further and further and further. So then my father was dying and died in 2011. And that's what finally was the impetus that forced me to take the time to do my own grief. So the feelings of regret, forgiving myself, anxiety, guilt, all of the above layered into this, as you can imagine. Having a sister with a mental illness, I don't think you ever forgive yourself that you never did enough. Why didn't you do this? Maybe it wouldn't have happened. Being the sole survivor of the siblings, why me? Why am I the only one left? So there's all these complicated emotions. And I think that I'm a figure skater, and I skate, which is my solace. And I think, in your heart says one thing and your mind says another. And same like with skating, when I'm learning an element, my mind says one thing, and my 66-year-old body doesn't do the other. So the two need to talk to each other, and being compassionate to yourself. And I think that it takes a lot of work, a lot of help, and knowing that you have other people to talk to, and, organizations like Reimagine and For Grief, and having somebody to talk to, and time and being compassionate to yourself. But it takes a lot of work, and you just have to be open.
Before I bring in Sundari, I do want to ask you, Judy, a follow-up question, which is that your book, Celebration of Sisters, gave birth to a movement that you created that did bring you some sort of solace. Reid, you talk about this on your Grief Refuge podcast about making meaning, keeping memories alive, honoring loved ones as a way of parsing through anxiety, depression, perhaps guilt. And I want to show some pictures, Judy, of what you have done in honor of your sisters through ice skating. You put together a fundraiser for Mass General Hospital in Boston. Tell us what we're looking at here.
So my sisters and I skated, so I wanted to honor them in a way that was meaningful in November because it's their birthdays and also the anniversary of Jane's death. So I started as 10 skaters and it mushroomed into 92 skaters. And I did my first solo performance, and we skate, and it benefits Massachusetts General Hospital, and it mushroomed into a beautiful community skating event. And it was kind of my way of honoring my sisters, and for so many years talking about them and sharing them. And when I skate, as with the balloons there, I kind of feel like I have each of them on my shoulder and saying to me, Judy, you've got this, you're out there. And the shy middle sister is out there performing in front of a crowd.
The reason why I wanted to bring this up is that going back to how I started with Reid and talking about Grief Refuge, you're talking about being purposeful as a way of moving through grief, not dismissing it, but moving through. You've talked about honoring your sisters as a way of grappling. All that is a part of agency. And owning the fact that we are required, in order for us to move forward, to take small steps, to put one foot in front of the other, to attend a For Grief event, right? To take a For Grief, on-demand course on the website, to do things that are for you when you're able to. And I just love that. And that brings me to what Sundari, and why I wanted Sundari Malcolm to be on this event stage today. And welcome, Sundari. I do want to talk with you. You are just remarkable. And I don't think you know this, but we have a lot in common. I know you lost both your mom and your dad. I believe, I'm not mistaken, both to cancer. My mom and dad as well. You are the BIPOC grief educator and care curator at the dinner party. Explain what that means. Talk about the dinner party just as a way of entering my conversation with you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. Thank you to everyone who's here sharing space with us. The Dinner Party is a nonprofit that is for people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s that have experienced significant loss. And I came to the Dinner Party as a griever in 2013. It's a peer-to-peer connection, so we call it the Dinner Party because we have tables where there is a host and then dinner partiers. If you were thinking about the gala in your head, that's not exactly it. Food's not actually required as much as it is the discussion and the discourse and connection that usually happens over food, right? And over the table. We were in person and now we're virtual. We have thousands of tables across the United States that consist of 10 to 12 people. We also have something called the buddy system, which is for those who perhaps feel like 10 to 12 people might be too much, and so we connect them one-on-one. We also are heavily driven by the idea of connecting people with those that mirror themselves. So whether it's a loss type or a culture, that it is that you are able to sit with people for whom not just the thread of grief is shared, but perhaps where you came from, how you walked with your family, how your culture is influencing you. And so I came as a griever, and I went on as staff in 2016 and have been a birth and death doula for the last 15 years. And I will say that the dinner party continues to be just an extremely impactful organization. The role, when people are like, well, what does BIPOC grief educator and care curator mean? BIPOC, for those who are unaware, is Black, Indigenous, people of color. And we decided as we moved the civil rights movement over the last few years that it was necessary that there was a department that was focused on the nuances of grief among the Black and Brown population. And care curator, because we believe in creating safe spaces and ones that are authentic, and ones that feel really, really good. I also just want to correct Christina on the website. It's a healingdoula.com. Soul Sundari is old, but I can correct it in the chat.
I'll fix that.
For those to find me.
Thank you. No, I'm very grateful that you're doing that. I saw that. Perfect. Thank you for doing that. What you didn't talk about yet, you talked about death doulaing, birth doulaing, but I also know you come at this work through meditation and yoga. And this seems to be a thread. So Reid can talk about nature. He's such a believer in the power of nature to heal. Judy can talk about the importance of investing in a physical activity that she connects with her sisters, that she can then pull forward to now. But you do it through meditation, you do it through yoga. Help us understand how those two practices specifically can be useful when it comes to anxiety, depression, guilt, grief, loss, and how we manage this cauldron of emotions.
Big question. But yes, I think it's important to note that I was raised half of my life on an ashram. And so these practices are ones that I was born with. And so when I was moving through grief, it's what I relied on. What I've seen as I've made grief my profession and death work my profession is that when we're moving through grief and loss, one of the things I think we all feel is untethered, right? Is a complete lack of control. And what I feel deeply is that when you can find things that you absolutely have a control over, it allows you to feel a bit more balanced as you navigate, especially something as heavy and as turbulent and as shifting as grief and loss can be. And so the breath is something that you can control, right? And whether you are into it for the spiritual reason or the biological reason, the breath does impact the nervous system, and you cannot possibly heal with an unbalanced, unsettled nervous system. So whether you are ready mentally to move through your grief or not, and we all get to places where sometimes we're like, I'm not there yet. What you can do at least, right, is breathe and make your breath your best friend. For meditation, it's the same, except that I think most people think of meditation as this, like, I must be sitting in a cave in silence and adhering to solitude. And there's a million different forms of meditation, and I suggest people to try them all, because grief keeps changing, right? And loss keeps changing. And so when you can have all of these tools in your tool belt and say, okay, now I need to meditate by focusing on a candle flame because I find my anxiety shooting off the roof and I need something to help me focus. Or now I need to take a walking meditation because I feel like grief is trapped in my body and I'm feeling like that flight or fright, so I need to get moving. Yoga, because grief is energy and energy gets trapped in the body. And that is real. And we can think about this when we think about happiness, right? When you're happy, you usually feel that in your system. When you are nervous, your palms sweat, my nose sweats. It's like a weird twitch that I have. We feel things. When you feel something about someone that feels a little off, you can really feel it in your gut, right? The body responds to what's happening. And for grief and loss, so often we shut down because that's what keeps us protected. However, the body still holds on to it. And what I found within my own practice and what I find with my students and clients is what we don't handle internally often presents itself physically. And so I think a lot of us who have moved through grief realize we wound up with all of these physical ailments. And in order to, it's hard to deal with emotional and physical at the same time. And so what you kind of control is at least the breath and the movement, at least biologically impacts the nervous system. And when you are ready to tackle the rest, then you can. But
I think that's so helpful. One of our participants, and I think it's pronounced Piper, said in the comment that she was hoping that we would address anxiety, guilt, and depression today. And so far, I have not heard those topics addressed at all. And to me, I think we're right in the heart of it. I think the breath work that you're describing is at the heart of it. I think that what Reid was talking about before about purpose is helping to perhaps calm some of that energy into something that can be more positive. And I think Judy had talked about that too, about keeping the memory of her sisters, her older sister and her younger sister, alive in the ice skating work that she has done for charity for Mass General Hospital. So I hope by underscoring what we are talking about today, Anne, I don't want you to feel like you've come and not gotten out of this what you came for, but I believe we are hitting it on the head. But I will dive even deeper now with my question for Reid. I know that you do. I could even tell by the background that you chose. You're a big believer in nature as an opportunity for healing. And I'm just wondering, what do you find about nature that is so soothing and can help alleviate grief, depression, and anxiety?
Well, if I'm lucky enough, when I find spaces in nature, I feel like it's the sound of silence that really has an impact on my own nervous system. And I hope that resonates with our guests and visitors today, because I think with nature, the sound of silence, I agree with the overwhelm previously mentioned, as far as that being kind of like a hand-in-hand process when grieving. So when you think about how much overwhelm and just how much anxiety, let's speak to anxiety about this and tie it into nature for a second. You know, this perhaps hopelessness, this strong feeling of so much tremendous worry of how one is going to survive, survive this significant loss. Starting to get emotional thinking about it, just embodying the feeling of like how anxiety can impact someone's like life after loss. If you get out into nature, well, that sound of that silence, I do believe that soothes. I do believe that comforts. I've never met a person who said I didn't enjoy my experience in nature, especially to help process my grief. And I've talked to thousands of people about grieving in nature, and so. I think the last thing I'll say about the nature piece, Allison, is that peripherally or subconsciously, nature is always regenerating. It's changing all the time. And Sundari mentioned the thing about grief changing all the time. What a beautiful metaphor, to have that reflected back to you as you process your feelings. Your feelings change. Well, nature's going to change too. Matter of fact, right above my computer, I can see out 7 acres of the woods. Well, I'm in Northeast Ohio right now. The leaves are changing colors. And it's a reminder that like soon they're going to fall. And eventually, all this green I'm seeing is not going to be green anymore. And that in the long run has a very positive effect on the psychological responses to the grieving process, because it helps remind us that impermanence is the permanent, impermanence is the thing of reality for us.
I think that's so helpful. And what you're describing is actually grounded in scientific research. What the science shows is that there's an uptick in our feelings of well-being when we are in nature. And the way it was explained in one of these reports that I have read and digested over the years, and I found this so interesting, and I will pass it along. When we are in our lives, there is so much that people ask of us. There are so many demands on us throughout the day, whether it's work, family, friends, just keeping the house clean. But when you go outside and you go into nature, it's a show that requires nothing of you. You get to be a passive recipient of that energy, of that magic. And so it's restorative because you don't need to produce anything in order to then enjoy what nature has. I want to pause just for a second because we're at the half an hour mark, just to remind you, put your questions in the chat. We'll be getting to more of your questions very soon, but I do want to make sure that I give a shout out to Reid, Judy, and Sundari's social media. So Reid, as the creator of Grief Refuge, you're on Facebook at Grief Refuge. On Instagram, it's Grief Refuge app. You have a great app, by the way. I want to talk about that in a second. Sundari, for the dinner party on X, formerly known as Twitter, Dinner Partiers, Instagram, The Dinner Party, and on Facebook, this is The Dinner Party. So we got all that covered. Judy Lipson, of course, you can find you on your website. Your book is Celebration of Sisters. It's never too late to grieve. Your Instagram is celeb, like celebration, celeb of sisters. And your Facebook is Judy Lipson, author. And of course, for grief, I highly recommend that you explore all the resources that For Grief has. There are on-demand courses, there are free downloadable resources that you can take advantage of. Of course, events like this, the past events that we have links to all those past recordings. And For Grief is at For Grief on Facebook. There's a For Grief community page. So if you all wanted to join the For Grief community page and continue the conversation after we are done here today, that is also open to you. And on Instagram, it's For Grief, but with an underscore, for_grief. So I do have some more questions, of course, and then I'm going to get to everyone's. I hope you guys are populating the chat. That would be amazing if you guys can do that. But I alluded, Reid, to your app, and the Grief Refuge app is extraordinary. You talk about journaling. You have a My Grief Journey part of the app too, which has a daily questionnaire to help the bereaved. The Daily Refuge, which is, again, back to what Sundari was talking about, meditations and reflections. With the scope of what you do on the app, help us understand what are the touch points that would be helpful to us if we are really having difficulty managing anxiety, depression, or guilt.
Yeah,
what parts of the app would be most useful?
Essentially, I would say the Grief Refuge app is a validation tool. It's a validation tool to help you just feel more seen and feel more heard, that what your experience is normal, it's human, and it won't be stigmatized like so much of what our culture throws out about our grieving processes. And so with that said, I'm a fan of the Daily Refuge, and what that is, everybody, is it's just every day something new is published as far as an audio message that you can listen to. It's got a kind of meditative tone. It's intended to help soothe and soften the experience for you. And it's, it's anywhere from 4 to 7 minutes, and it's just very comforting. People feel very comforted when they listen to it.
I know I did. Your voice is like silk. When I listen to the app, I just, it's you and it's your voice and it's incredibly comforting. And yeah, I think it's a wonderful resource that I think that people can avail themselves to. How would they find the app if they wanted to take advantage of it?
It's super easy. Just pick up your phone, go to your app store and search Grief Refuge. It's as simple as that. It's a free download.
Okay. Judy, something that you have said surprised me, and I want to talk about it a little bit. I think it's applicable to many people. So much of the time, if we're caught up in what I would say as a broad stroke, these negative emotions that we're trying to help remedy, anxiety, depression, or guilt, we can, some of us, begin to ruminate and to not get out of our own cycle of thinking. For you, a break becomes physical, and it literally is you going into the ice skating rink and being active. Why it was surprising to me is that that was an activity that you and your sisters enjoyed together. And so some folks might feel like that was actually going to be stirring negative emotions. But for you, it's actually comforting to be in an environment that you have associated with your two sisters. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, I think subconsciously, I think I didn't know that it was always there. Like I skated sporadically, off and on throughout my whole life. And I think because I had suppressed the grief and didn't talk about them, this is my way of coming full circle back to them and almost bringing them back into my life, if that makes any sense to anybody. So this was my way of bringing them back home and back into my life and sharing them with me. So it brought a lot of comfort and something that we always shared. And I think subconsciously, even though it was always there, so it brought me a lot of comfort. So how some people might have talked about them all these years, I didn't. And I didn't have a lot of memorabilia. There was no social media. I didn't have a lot of pictures. So this was sort of my connection to them that I had, that a lot of people have other things, connection to their family or lost ones. This was my connection to them. And that's why I held on to it, I think.
It's really brave to share so much of your journey, Judy. So I'm grateful for that. One thing, Sundari, that we haven't talked about is your work in the caregiving space. Our conversations today have talked about us collectively as grievers, and we haven't really addressed end of life or prep for end of life and the burden on caregivers. And I wonder how you see that being intertwined with self-care, with making sure that we are steeling ourselves emotionally and physically for what can be elongated journeys with these emotions.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I was a caregiver for my mother for almost a decade and my father for 3 years right after my mother passed. And I will say that at that time, I was in my 20s. This was in the 2000s, 2007. My mother passed in 2011. My father passed. At that point, I was much younger, and I don't know that I was really aware of all the tools. So I don't want to pretend to say at that time I had it correct. What I will say in reflection and things that I eventually started to learn was anticipatory grief was exhausting. The constant the anticipation, I'm having trouble speaking today, the waiting for the phone calls, right? The sitting at home and waiting for when this news is going to change, how bad is it going to be today? the stress over needing to work and also care, the moods that shift, right, as the health changes. Also, I think as a caregiver, I also recognized how different my experience was with my mother than it was with my father, right? Because I had completely different relationships. One was complicated and one had been my caregiver my whole life. And so the experience was much different. I think that when you think about self-care at that time, it can be really, really hard to imagine what caring for yourself feels like when you're caring for somebody else. And so I think taking minimal steps, doing something that just sets a foundation for you, and I'll give an example. I used to assign roles to my friends, and I was very clear with them about why I needed them to be a certain way, right? So an example was one of them called me just to tell me about what was going on in her life. And then somebody was assigned to call me and say, how are you right now? I'm running to the mall or I'm running to the grocery store. Can I pick you guys up something? That sort of foundation is what allowed me to be a bit more present in my caregiving journey, but also a bit less hard on myself because I could not take care of all those things and myself and my parents. I think that another really hard thing is carving out time to walk away from it, right? As a caregiver, it becomes your everyday, all day. I think that it is imperative, it is necessary, it is absolutely something that needs to happen for you to have time for yourself. If that means an hour, and that means that you might have to ask people that you don't normally ask for things, but if somebody can just come sit in the house so you can leave and not be worried about what's happening while you've left. I think that something that doesn't get talked often about enough is the guilt that can come when that person passes after you've been a caregiver for a long time. And to speak to what Reid mentioned, there is a relief that can come. And then there is a guilt that follows for being relieved and you're also grieving. And it becomes a vicious kind of cycle in your head. And I'll be honest, there's no easy answer through that, except that it's accepting that both can be true at the same time.
I think what you're talking about, at least for me, is isolation and feeling that in some ways you might be the only one going through that when you're in the caregiver space and you step away. The whole experience may be counter to what your peers are experiencing. When my parents were both sick from cancer, I was in my young 20s. My mother died when I was 25 and my father died when I was 31. And that was not what my peers were up to in terms of the experience of guilt to step away and maybe have a drink with my friends or a cup of coffee with my friends or a meal with my friends. That felt normal, but it came with baggage because what I wasn't doing to make space for myself during that time. And so when we talk about these feelings, I think for me, at least, there's this thread or this hum of feeling alone. And that's where I feel like these conversations are really helpful. They're validating to know that other people are going through it too. That's why people join, Facebook groups, right? So you can, be in it together. Like I said, For Grief has that Facebook community page, and it's really helpful. Let me pause there for a second. We have 16 whole minutes left to answer even more questions from everyone who has attended. I'm going to pass the mic, as they say, to Christina, who has been going through the chat. If you have more questions, please populate them into the chat so Christina can see them, and we'll try to get through as many as we can.
Great. So the first question that we have is, can you talk about handling complicated grief, meaning the person you have lost is both beloved and a problematic figure in your life?
Who wants to take that one? Sundari.
I can speak to that. As I mentioned, my mother and I had a relationship that was completely opposite from my father and I. And when I loved him deeply because he was my father, right? But also we didn't have much of a connection, and I felt like he didn't deserve what I'd given my mother, to be honest. And there was a lot of wanting certain conversations to happen before he passed that didn't, and so the anger wrapped up in that. I think what I try to remind myself often of is, and other people, is that we're human. And that is something that I think we forget, that you're not supposed to be good at this, right? Like, you're not supposed to have this figured out. You're supposed to surround yourself with people who can hold you and hold space for you, and you're supposed to figure out what makes you feel good in this moment and then something else in the next moment. But to be honest, there is no blanket answer. There is an acceptance of this is complicated. There is an acceptance and surrendering to, some days I feel this way, really sad, and some days I'm angry, and some days I'm ambivalent, and some days I don't even remember what date they died, and some days I am sitting in the midst of heavy, heavy loss at why there's so many, right? And I think it's accepting yourself at every version that you meet yourself. And I think grief will offer you a million different versions of yourself. And the way that you deeply care for yourself is to meet each version and to figure out how to walk with her that day or that hour.
Thank you. Thank you. Christina.
Next is a question from Carol, who's been reading about emotional labor. She says, I'm reminded how difficult it is to be so polite and human and functioning when all of you is consumed by grief. Any advice on how to handle this?
Reid, what do you think?
I'll start by saying, gosh, emotional intelligence comes to mind. And how does one practice emotional intelligence when they're grieving? Because so much energy is invested in just surviving. So I would say make a pact with yourself before speaking to anything and reacting. Just take a moment to pause and breathe, and then go from there. You may still feel similar, or you may say to yourself, okay, I'm gonna just chill in this moment, and then process the emotions later. But taking an extra second just to check in with yourself, that would be a pointer from me.
Reid, what do you do on your grief retreats? Describe what's coming up in the Bahamas.
Well, in the Bahamas, it's really special because we're going to connect with dolphins in the sea. And these are wild dolphins, so we don't touch them. We just swim near them. And that's a collaboration with WildQuest, which is an organization that has a retreat center down in Bimini. But at the retreats, it's really about helping provide the space for participants to gain in some new perspectives. We obviously, our grieving process and our grief journeys and how they're unique from one another is the foundation of the retreat experience. But what I've come to learn in doing this for 2 years is that when people walk away from the grief retreat and they had their experience, they now have some different perspective, and that helps them reconcile their loss a little bit more effectively.
There are other events too, like Sundari. I know the dinner party has like a grief camp. Can you talk about that?
Yes, very exciting. So I know there have been questions about, why does the dinner party only serve people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s? That it was an intentional decision, and really because there is a lot of support for those who are above 40, usually tied to family, usually tied to the age group, usually has more support. 20s, 30s, and 40s tend to be more transient, tend not to have more structured support in career and or family at that time. That being said, the camp is open to all ages. We only serve the United States. The camp is open to all countries. It's going to be a week long from October 1st through October 6th. There will be facilitators offering workshops that range from panel discussions to story time and nap time for grievers, to yoga, to meditation, to conversations about complicated loss. And then there's a final dinner party with an amazing poet that we're so excited for. On top of that, for anyone who's attending camp, there's 3 months of after camp post care. Because we didn't want to excavate all of the feelings and then say, thanks for coming to camp and leave. And so you have 3 months of being able to access healers, facilitators, workshop, connect with each other, talk about your experience at camp. We're really excited. We did in-camp in person before the pandemic and have shifted virtual, and have found that it allows people to be truly authentic when you're at home and you can turn your camera off, perhaps. And it has opened it up to people who usually are not able to access us, right? And so I think it's going to be an amazing week. You can head to our website and sign up. And it's just going to be a really beautiful offering for grievers around the world to come together.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I'm so grateful to know about it. And this is actually a good segue. I want to mention that there is something called the Grief Calendar on the forgrief.com website. And on the Grief Calendar, you will see like a clearinghouse of all sorts of different grief-specific events across the country. They're all online, so they are all accessible to everyone. Most of them are at no cost. Some of them, there's a small fee, or maybe a larger fee, but there's a fee. But they are meant to give you one-stop shopping access to see what can I take advantage of so I don't have to feel alone. I think that's one of the important points of conversations like this, is to feel that, wow, I didn't know there was this or that, or a grief retreat in the Bahamas, or a grief camp from the dinner party, or a book about sister loss and the importance of physical activity and ice skating that can connect us to our siblings. And Judy, before I go on to the next question, there's something else that I thought was really remarkable about your work, and that is that you have felt what contributed in some ways to anxiety and depression. And you can change my words if I'm not being completely on the nose for you, is that you felt your loss was somewhat dismissed, that siblings get the shaft, that siblings are not given their due when it comes to grief and loss. Explain what you're describing.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, my sisters, one died in 81 and one died in 90. And thank goodness things have shifted since then. But back then there was very little for siblings, and siblings are kind of the ones that are kind of put in the back seat. And I think that it's not, people don't understand the sibling relationship and the impact of the loss, and how much a sibling is somebody you expect that you're going to live your whole life with, and what a void it is in your life. And I really had no one. And now there are more groups for sibling loss, and Facebook groups and compassionate friends and open to hope groups like this that are more open to siblings. And I'm so grateful for it. And I also want to make the point that, my parents, it was their loss. Everybody always asks, how are your parents? Do they ever ask, how are you? And I'm also an introvert, and I don't know if there's any introverts in the group. And sometimes the grieving is a very different process, that sometimes groups aren't for you. But if you can find, one person to talk to, I think that's a very good thing. And then, everybody has to find their landing place in grief, and whatever that works for you. But the most important thing is that you're not alone with your grief. Like you've mentioned, I think Sundari mentioned it, Allison mentioned it, Reid mentioned it, and finding what works for you. But at the time of my grief, I had no one to talk to. And, now I have, thank goodness, a big network, and I'm very grateful for that and to be able to share it. And I just hope that my wish is that anybody who goes through it has somebody to share it with.
Thank you. Christina, we have a time for a couple lightning round questions. Let's make sure we get in everyone's questions if we can before we start wrapping up. But I will say, do not think that once we are done at the strike of 2 o'clock here in New York Eastern Time, that means the conversation is over. I know that from Judy's point of view and Reid's point of view at the Grief Refuge and Sundari's point of view at the dinner party, we welcome continuing conversations. Of course, For Grief does too. I don't think I mentioned enough the For Grief community page. You can jump right on there and continue the conversation. So I know it feels like we've just gotten started, and then sometimes when we're done with the conversation, you feel like you have, oh, I forgot to ask that question. But that's why social media has such a wonderful upside sometimes. It's because we can continue talking about these very important topics. But Christina, please, lightning round, let's go.
Okay, we've received this question from about a dozen people. How do you handle guilt of feeling happy after your loved one had died, just moving on in life? Life is going on and you catch yourself happy and you feel really guilty about it. What can you do about that?
Well, Judy's raising her hand. Go.
Embrace it. And I will give you an example. The last time I saw my sister was to celebrate my 25th birthday. My birthday always held a cloud, and for years. And I met with one of her friends, and her friend said to me, your sister would want you to celebrate you and be happy. So I leave you with that thought.
I'll add to the lightning round real quick. I would add in the conversation just being able to recognize and reframing any judgment. You may be judging yourself for feeling relieved or happy, and try to reframe that, because there's nothing wrong with the way you feel.
Sundari.
Just to add to all of this, also knowing that the gaps of that will increase, right? So I think in the beginning, it's often every time you find yourself laughing or any time you're enjoying yourself. And then I think as time moves on, it does begin to space out. And so knowing that it won't always feel like every time I'm happy, I catch myself. I can't say that it disappears immediately. It's been a while for me. And sometimes I'm still like, oh, I just got great news. I wish I could call my mom. But I will say that there's also lots of times now that I'm able to fully enjoy and be present. And it is not the next thought that I'm also a griever. So
I'm going to give some different advice and guidance that I feel is well informed by all the grief work that I've done over the years. I think if we give ourselves time to fully invest uninterrupted in our grief, it'll allow us to then fully invest uninterrupted in joy. And so the greatest example of this to me is what Hope Edelman has done with Motherless Daughters and Motherless Daughters Day. So many women who are moms who have lost their own mothers have difficulty on Mother's Day because they're grieving the loss of their moms. So what Hope did beautifully is that the Saturday before Mother's Day, the day before, she sets aside for mothers or motherless daughters just to grieve their moms, so that on Mother's Day, you can be physically completely present and accept the warmth of your family. So I think if we give permission to ourselves to give grief 100%, then we're more able to give our joys 100%, because we haven't given short shrift to our loved ones and how much we miss them. So I want to thank Sundari Malcolm from the dinner party, again on Twitter, Dinner Partiers, on Instagram, The Dinner Party, on Facebook, This is The Dinner Party. Reid Peterson, thank you so much for being here. The Grief Refuge is such a wonderful resource on Facebook, Grief Refuge, on Instagram. the Grief Refuge app. And Judy Lipson, of course, you have a website, your author website on Instagram, Celeb of Sisters, meaning celebration of sisters, and on Facebook, Judy Lipson author. And of course, you can always catch For Grief here in our next series in the past and present event conversation, of course. But For Grief is also on Instagram at @forgrief_, _grief, and then Facebook For Grief. And this has been a joy. I am so glad that the Reimagine Past and Present Conversation series For Grief sponsored is back. And I can't wait to see you guys next month. Thank you so much for being here. Sundari, Judy, Reid, thank you. See you guys next time.